Hey, I'd like to welcome R. Kikuo Johnson. My name is Eric Reynolds. I'm the Associate Publisher of Fantagraphics, and I'm really excited to talk to Kikuo today about his two new books. We've got Night Fisher and No One Else coming out this October and November, respectively. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for organizing, and I'm very happy to chat with an old friend.
Yeah, it's really great to see you. I was just telling you, I don't think we've actually seen each other face to face in probably over a decade.
It's been too long, but yeah, I do keep up with all your interviews and stuff, so I feel like I see you all the time.
Well, right back at you. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and show it. I brought this out. I think that I've clipped literally every single New Yorker illustration you've ever done.
Wow, wow, that's right. That's the first one too, right? The front. That was
That's what I wanted to ask you. So I wanted to ask you, it seems like you just kind of came in. I wasn't planning on diving right into this, but you kind of segued me right into it. This first one is a Tad Friend article about cops of some sort. I don't know what, but that's your first piece?
Yeah, that's it. Yep. That was my uh first illustration for the New Yorker, and that was my second professional illustration ever.
No
Um,
kidding. All right.
yeah, and I really hit a jackpot on the first job, and part of that was um, between the year it was taking. So I had already reached out to Fantagraphics, sent the cold submission with Night Fisher, and we signed a contract, and the book was coming out, but there was a year, of course, of waiting for all the publication stuff to go through.
Sure.
And so I was putting together a portfolio of work and sending comics to magazines, just hoping they'd publish comics. Just totally wide-eyed kid, have no idea how this stuff works. And I was just making up email addresses. So for that art director, it was the first name underscore last name at
Right.
newyorker.com, and just make up email addresses. And she wrote me back and was like, well, we have nothing, we don't want to publish this comic that you've made, but I have a galley of Night Fisher on my desk. I love it. Do you want to do an illustration for us? And I was like, absolutely.
Wow.
So
Was
that
this
was my
Francois Mouly?
no, that was
No.
it was an art director named Chris Curry, still
Oh,
working,
okay.
and I owe so
I
much to
recognize
her.
that name.
Yeah, she was, I 15 years later, I realize how a lot of these editors saw what they were getting from me, which was totally rough and unprofessional, and took a chance on me and developed me over years, which I didn't realize was happening at the time. But now, in hindsight, I'm like, wow, I owe a lot to those first art directors, Chris especially.
That's awesome. Yeah, it was great pulling these out, and because I wasn't sure if that was the very first one, but it looked like you just kind of once you landed in the magazine, you were in the magazine. You had pieces every month or two, it seemed like.
Yeah,
and I would argue that the work was really rough. I mean, I hardly.
well, thanks. I guess it looks rough to me in hindsight, but
I mean, DC Comics would be so lucky to get you to actually draw a comic for them, rather than having the New Yorker pay you to draw Superman.
yeah. I was doing my best, kind of Alex Toth meets Kurt Swan there.
Yeah, right. So you're conscious of the fact that basically you just had your 15th anniversary of working for the magazine?
Well, yeah. Well, I hadn't actually thought about that, but yeah, it's it. I guess it's been a while. Yeah,
And it coincides perfectly almost with the 15th anniversary of Night Fisher, really.
Sure. Yeah. Not by accident, those two. Night Fisher is my doorway into my entire career, so I owe so much to that book.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit. We're really here to talk about the brand new book, but I don't think you can talk about the new book without kind of touching on Night Fisher. The book is absolutely gorgeous. And I can say with certainty that it's almost, entirely your doing. You have one of the most, you understand printing and book production as well as any cartoonist I think I've ever met, aside of probably Chris Ware. Um, so let's talk about what you did with the book this time around, because it's a new edition in hardcover from, I actually have the original softcover here, but it's a little bit more than a new edition. It doesn't include like a ton of extras or anything like that, like, you know, interviews about the book, but you did substantially kind of director's cut the book. Can you tell us how you kind of approach that?
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, there's no new pages, there's no new scenes, but I went through the book and every single page was retouched to some degree. Whether it at the most kind of limited, it would be like cleaning up the lettering. The lettering was just a little. I'd like to see it a little tight. After seeing many foreign editions and seeing what happens when the lettering got tightened up through translation.
Oh, interesting.
I realized like there was a magic that was happening that made the art more clear in a way with the lettering. So that influenced that. And then on the more extreme end, rearranging panel order just in a couple cases, just to make the reading a little more fluid. So it was less about maybe changing the book and more about making the book just more cohesive and solid. The most consistent and biggest change was getting some of the secondary characters' faces to be consistent throughout. That was the biggest change. Some of the secondary characters, they just weren't consistent from page to page and scene to scene. That was actually a process I had started during its first edition, where I finished the book, and then before it was published, I went back and redrew a bunch of the faces, and I kind of just like finished that off this time around in 2021 to like make it all cohere more solidly. So I do think this is the definitive edition.
Awesome. I have two questions, I guess, about that. Like, well, one, more of a comment. It seems like that kind of, you know, consistency in drawing faces is like something that a lot of cartoonists struggle with, maybe certainly earlier in their careers. And I wonder why that is, other than the fact that faces are just hard to be consistent about from different angles and whatnot. But I know, like, I remember Dan Clowes, you know, redrew almost all of Enid and Rebecca's faces in the first few chapters of Ghost World when he collected it. So I don't know, it's kind of interesting because you're both great cartoonists, and yet you're mere mortals at the same time, I suppose.
Yeah, it's probably part of just the natural process of, you don't really know what the character looks like until you've drawn that character 100 times. And so
oh yeah, right.
Yeah, you know, like the evolution of Charlie Brown or whatever. It's
right.
It's probably part of it, but also just after 15 years of drawing as an illustrator, I felt like, well, I can really make some of these faces sing in a way that I couldn't before. Let me just, I mean, a lot of it is just like control freak artist nature. Like, let me take one more stab at this. I can make this so much better.
No, it completely works. I mean, I've read it several times now, obviously, and I think you made the book better in every way with every change. Were you making a bunch of these fixes like simultaneous to working on No One Else?
I'm bad at like multitasking, so I think I can't actually remember at this point, but I think I did most of the Night Fisher changes like in a month where I just needed to get some distance from, or 2 months or so when I needed to get some distance from No One Else. And it was a kind of a nice, slightly more intuitive process. Instead of like thinking about the plot of a new book or anything, I could just kind of look and intuitively draw.
Because stylistically they're pretty different. Is it hard to like shift gears like that and get into that Night Fisher mode of, you know, where your line was when you were that age, when you did it the first time?
It was definitely tricky. I don't think I could draw a new Night Fisher page like from scratch. Like I just don't.
And have it look consistent with the rest.
Yeah. I think if you really weren't paying attention, if you're hopefully engrossed in the story enough to not notice, maybe it could pass. But there's an attack with the drawing tools of Night Fisher that I don't think I could mimic at this point.
Yeah.
But but when it was just faces and stuff, I could kind of adjust what was there, and I think make it seamless, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I think you absolutely did. So let's get into No One Else a little bit.
Yeah.
This is an absolutely wonderful book. I think it's interesting how this book, to my mind, like it absolutely reflects the Kikuo I know, but 15 years older and more mature, in a way that Night Fisher is a wonderful book. It's a coming of age story, whereas this is a much more adult, kind of dramedy. We talked about the New Yorker and your 15 years, and so let's get into why, how did you decide to get back into the comics game?
Yeah. I never, my intention was excuse me. My intention was never to be a professional illustrator, but just like living in New York and trying to figure out a way to approximate a middle-class life led me down the path of illustration, and I'm so grateful that path was there. But that the drive to make comics never left me, and for the last 15 years, I've been dreaming up new stories and writing them down, writing scripts, doing some sketches and stuff. But life and life just kind of got in the way, and then it was really in a few years ago when my partner decided to go to grad school, and I was like, okay, if you're going to spend 2 years dedicated to bettering your life and um, living like a college student, it's like, me too. I'm gonna just stop everything, live lean, and pursue a passion here. It happened to line up with the pandemic, which, as tragic as that was, it worked out well for making a focused kind of writer's retreat situation.
Huh.
And it was like two extremely happy and gratifying years of my life, despite a lot of the tragedies that were happening. Um, it worked out.
I know a number of people who, for what reason or another, have done okay during the pandemic, whether it's cartoonists who just didn't have to adjust mentally as much to kind of being alone at home, or what. And I think I sense a tinge of guilt, as you kind of say that, but really for us comics fans, it's great. It's nothing to be ashamed of. So one thing I wanted to ask you about both books is Hawaii, where you grew up, and it's still so infused in both works, and yet you moved away at a rather young age, and as far as I know, aside from going back to visit family, you've mostly lived on the East Coast for as long as I've known you. What's your relationship with Hawaii these days? Because I also think I see some interesting progression or evolution or whatever in the Hawaii you depict in Night Fisher and the one that's in No One Else. So
Yeah. It's a great question. So I left when I was 18 to go to college, and went back for the holidays every year until the pandemic. It was the
You went
first.
to RISD.
Went to RISD, yep. So yeah, stayed on the East Coast, and then after college, moved to New York City, and once I got a foothold in like freelance illustration, that gave me the luxury to go home for a month or so. So I would still spend about a month, and I have a lot, like many of my best friends and of course my family are out there. So, but definitely there's a big difference between being there a month out of a year and living there, and having your fingers enmeshed in the politics and the kind of day-to-day life of Hawaii. But it's still, I guess part of it is just like drawing comics is this like long period of quiet solo rumination that is kind of the job of the cartoonist. And like, where else would I want to do that than Hawaii. So I can sit and spend 2 years mentally imagining Hawaii, imagining being there, imagining kind of experiences I've had there. And also just from like a kind of uh, practical perspective, like another part of comics is like envisioning a space and characters moving around a space. And Maui is kind of this like limited domain that I know incredibly well. I feel, I spent my entire life kind of climbing up cliffs and walking around hitting corners. And so I can envision this entire space very, very well. And so that just lends itself to writing stories. They come naturally.
I was going to ask you, are you able to really conjure that from memory, or, do you use a lot of reference or book combination both?
Yeah, a lot of memory. A lot of it is memory. I use a lot of photo reference in general, but just to kind of get things kind of again to spur different ideas. But a lot of it's just from memory, and maybe part of it is also that just Hawaii is such a vivid place to be, and it's so it's a place where you really interact with the landscape. It's not something you look at through the window. It's like you're in the water, you're on the cliff, like it's so visceral that it's just very vivid. And also like I could
I've
just
been
draw.
watching a
Oh,
show.
yeah. I
Oh
was
no,
just gonna
go.
say, it's also just like it's like a lot of artists they make the same drawing every 100 times. They might draw the same face 100 times. Like I could never stop drawing Maui. Like I could draw Maui from different angles for the rest of my life. It's just an endless wellspring.
That's awesome. Is there anything about Hawaii that you would want people to kind of know, especially in the States, like where most people haven't even been to Hawaii? And I'm just curious, like if you bring up the topic of the sugarcane fields in No One Else, and I'm just kind of wondering, what if there are big subjects that you wish like people kind of knew more about or were engaged with more.
When I was writing Night Fisher, that was definitely like an aspect of it for me where I felt like, especially at the time in the mid 2000s, or when I started in the early 2000s, every image of Hawaii that I saw in mass media was this, Hawaii is paradise, 51st dates, like this like background for tourists to like have a wonderful life. And I definitely, that was a motivating force where I was like, I want to, as a reader, I want to see the place that I'm from, like what it's like. And and in hindsight, I realized that I was really presenting it through a specific lens. It's not a universal image of Hawaii by any means, Night Fisher, but I do think that it represented a certain aspect of Maui specifically that hadn't been represented in the broader culture. And I felt a kind of mission to like, just kind of present it realistically because it just hadn't been before to my eyes. With No One Else, I feel less and less of that kind of mission. In terms of like a Hawaii that I want to expose to people, I don't feel that kind of like an evangelical element
Mm-hmm.
of that at all anymore. It's just and in general, I think that like No One Else is not a book that attempts to like teach anyone anything. It's
Oh, I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't mean to suggest otherwise.
Oh no, I didn't think you were.
It's just no, but for people who are watching who haven't read the book, it's something that's just kind of lingering in the background.
Sure.
It's not there's no agenda being pushed by any stretch.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the characters a little bit, because this really is a great character study. I guess, is it autobiographical at all? I suppose that's one place to start.
Sure. So there's three main characters in No One Else, and it's a adult working mother
Charlene.
full-time nurse, Charlene. Yep. And then her young son, if you count the candles in the comic, he's 8 years old. Uh, and her brother, who is not living on Maui but comes home for a visit. And it's not, the book isn't autobiographical, but I do feel, but there's that weird paradox that happens where I feel like this is the most autobiographical thing I've ever written, even though the events don't reflect my life in any way.
Right, right.
But I do feel like Robbie, the struggling musician artist who like can't get respect, the working mother who just wants to be left alone to like focus on her thing, and then this kid who feels completely misunderstood. Like, that's all me. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I could certainly see that, especially in, is it Brendan or Brandon? I'm sorry.
Brandon, yeah.
Brandon. You know, he would be the sort of obvious character that I would think you could relate to. But I was also wondering, like, I think you play a ukulele, right?
I do.
Do you have in your head, maybe not literally written, but do you hear Robbie's music?
That's a great question. You know, he evolved. Yeah, I totally 100% yes. I haven't written or played it, but I like, I know his repertoire. I can imagine. I think he's, in my mind, he's pretty versatile. But whether or not anybody would actually want to listen to what he's playing, it's different. But he can get a crowd going. He can get a. Yeah.
What does his singing voice sound like?
Ooh, I'm imagining something like affectedly gravelly. Yeah.
Excellent.
Like,
yeah. I would think, have you ever seen a show on, I think it's on Amazon Prime, called Patriot?
No.
There is a ukulele playing character on that show who I think could be a good stand-in.
Nice. Nice.
Which reminds me, this is a book that, like, I do think like a filmmaker could have a blast trying to sink their teeth into in casting. It's a really cinematic book in a way that I don't mean to take away from what a fantastic comic it is as well. You're a really gifted storyteller and cartoonist, and I don't have so much of a question as I want to underscore that it's a pleasure to have a new book from you after all this time, because like you said, I never thought you were gonna stop after Night Fisher, and while I totally understand why you haven't, it's just makes it all the more nice to have you back. I wanted to ask you about that was a long-winded way of getting to asking you about a couple of things that you were working on after Night Fisher that I wasn't quite sure whatever happened with, and that was specifically the Audubon stories.
Yeah, I had a number of fits and starts, and a number of at least 4 major abandoned graphic novels.
Oh, really?
Yeah, at least. And some that went really, I've actually got stacks of pages of if it seems like there's a stylistic jump, which there is, between Night Fisher and No One Else, like I've got the pages that I've
got connective tissue.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So those projects just eventually lost, I guess I just lost the muse. I just got, I don't have a good answer. Part of it was like, through a process of my 20s, changing relationships, changing places where I was living, like just growing into a different person. I think that's just one of the challenges with graphic novels, is they take so long to produce, at least in from the way I make them, which is very kind of in iterations and in drafts.
Well, in those Audubon stories, you probably didn't help yourself with all the cross-hatching that you gave yourself.
Like literally the worst, like the most nightmarish, like intricate drawing style for comics. But it seems like that's another thing a lot of young cartoonists do, is like, let me try to make this as like most awesome illustrated comic ever. And Yeah, some people can pull it off.
Well, as someone who's taught, I'm sure you've given that a lot of thought, because your evolution of your style up into no one else, it's a much more clear line kind of I don't want to say reduce, because I mean it's everything's there. I mean you draw luscious backgrounds and great figure drawing, but you have fine-tuned your style.
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of that, I mean, it kind of ties back. It's related to the movie aspect, or the cinematic quality that you pointed to, where I think when I was first starting out, and certainly my approach to Night Fisher was to um, have like this kind of like, first of all, luscious, cool drawings,
Mm-hmm.
and second of all, like this in my mind, I wanted this to be a pure comic. So on almost every page of Night Fisher, there's some kind of my young self was
Yeah.
trying to push the storytelling in like endemic comic storytelling ways, thinking of a page like collage, thinking of a page like diagrams and all that kind of stuff. And I was really thinking about comics. Maybe that was in the zeitgeist in that time as well. But with no one else, I was really like, I just want this to be. I was thinking a lot about Charlie Brown and a lot about Calvin and Hobbes, where I was like, when I've read those books 100 times. When I pull off Calvin and Hobbes, I can't stop read. Like it's just I don't choose to read it. It's just
Mm-hmm.
it's reading itself to me, and and then I find I'm like 20 pages in before I even
Right.
before any time has passed. And I was like, I really want to try to make a book like that. And part of that was like reduce down the style so you can read it instantly, and also so that every mark means something, and every mark, like you have the power to change a character's expression with just a tiny little mark or something. That's one of the, I think, potencies of Schultz. And then on this on the other aspect, like for years I was like adamantly like, don't make a comic that's like a movie, because like comics are comics and movies are movies.
Yes,
And
100%.
but actually it was actually reading Nick Dernasso, where I felt like his books are also cinematic, and while they're not movies, they're definitely endemically comics.
Yes, right.
um he gave me permission to actually like be more cinematic, and not get hung up on something like that, which I'm super grateful for. And because the thing about his comics too, and sorry, I'm getting long-winded here, but
No,
um
no.
part of it is like that part of Schultz, part of um Watterson, and then also part of Dernasso, and in his book Sabrina, is you forget you're reading it. It's
Mm-hmm.
just so consistent and so simplified. You're not distracted by lushly drawn scenes or anything. You're just so in it, and that was my first priority before like any kind of formal experimentation or anything. My first priority with no one else was like, let me just be as immersive as possible and disappear as much as I can.
I appreciate that perspective, because I relate to it. Like I think it's almost a dirty word to call a comic cinematic, because it does almost seem like a backhanded compliment or something to the medium, or dismissal of the medium, like, oh, it's such a good comic, it could be a movie. But I don't mean it like that at all. It's like
I didn't take it that way at all.
yeah.
I agree. I think I actually think it's very cinematic, and I agree 100% with you. That was the dirty word for me, and now I'm kind of embrace it a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the reasons I maybe use the term at all is because I've told several people about this since you and I did this, but you asked me to do basically a table reading of the book with you over the phone at one point. And I bring it up because in all my years of editing comics, I thought it was like one of the most interesting, fascinating exercises I've ever done in the service of editing a comic. So tell me like about how you kind of stumbled upon that, because you told me I wasn't the first person that you did that with.
Mhm. Um,
What is that? How did
yeah,
that work for you? And then first tell us what you asked us to do, and then what you got out of it as a comics maker.
Yeah. I rather than handing a draft to someone and having them read it and then give me notes, I wanted a reader that would read it to me out loud live, and so I could gauge their not only their reaction to certain scenes, but really just see what's coming through, and like and a reading not only reading the words but also describing the images, because
Hmm.
obviously like there are certain images that I draw and maybe I think something is obviously clear and being conveyed, but if it's not in your description as you read it, then obviously that's an edit I need to make. And I think I discovered that process working with Francoise Mouly on my all ages book, The Shark King, which I have right
Yeah,
here. And
fantastic book.
yeah, and she's just such an incredible editor, and kind of just would do that with me and read it back to me, and it's like a screening of a movie where you get to see if the audience is laughing or if the audience is bored, like
Yeah.
I just found it incredibly useful, and a big part of why that process. Oh, and also I do it with my students. So I teach comics at RISD, and I could just after years of giving them notes and like telling them like what to change or whatever, I realized that like that was actually way less useful than me just reading it to them. Like instead of me trying to impose what I think they should do, if I just read their comic to them, that says it all. And they're
So anyway, we got interrupted by the Zoom gods, I guess there, but yeah, those table readings, or for I don't know what you call them. That's what it reminded me of.
yeah, it's a great name for them. Yeah, and I just found that especially working with students, um, I realized that if I just got out of the way and instead of telling them my notes, telling them like changes I saw that might work better or suggestions, if I just got out of the way and read them what they put down and what I'm seeing is there, they'll recognize what's missing. Let the students, exercise their talents and figure it out. And so when it
Yeah.
was time for me to make my own book, I just found like I craved that and I needed that. And like in our reading together, like it's instantly like within seconds, I know, oh, I need to do this. Here's 10 changes that will make this flow and make this read. So
Hmm.
yeah,
That's a really interesting. Like you must be a good teacher, because it's one thing. I've done enough like portfolio reviews where you're kind of almost struggling for things to say at times, and there's only so many times you can um, talk about perspective or figure drawing or whatnot. And um, what you're doing is really just like getting them to see whether what they see on the page is communicating to somebody else. And that's what it's all about,
totally.
really.
Yeah, totally. And a lot of that is I learned from working with good art directors, where the good art directors will kind of do this. Well, they'll always want to push you in a certain direction, but the good ones will do it in a way that where an artist can be more themselves, and the bad ones will kind of corner you into a awkward space. So
Yeah. Um, I thought one reason I brought it up was I was wondering if it was something that was handed down to you by some other, by some professor that you admired, or I know you took classes from David Mazzucchelli and I don't know who else, but so I was wondering if it was part of some secret, cartoonist tradition.
actually, in a way, yes, in the sense that like that was part of David's class, which was just an amazing class to take, uh, where we would pin up our weekly assignments, and part of it was that he'd read them all, and I actually never made this connection. It's so obvious, but he'd pin them up, and we'd read all the comics um, line by line, and when something was confusing, like it was evident to everyone, and then we talk about it as a class. It made for grueling crits. This is a 5-hour class of sitting and reading line by line through comics. So it's absolutely grueling, but super super useful, and I do that in my own class. So it's funny because David was influential to me. I actually read his Rubber Blanket stuff in Italian before I ever read any of the Daredevil or Batman stuff. And that was the stuff that like resonated with me. I didn't actually read the Batman and Daredevil stuff till after I drew Night Fisher. But
Huh.
the having his class, like he was influential to me as an artist, but also really as a teacher as well. So I learned a lot, and I use his techniques in my own class.
You read Italian?
Oh, when I was working on night, I just dropped that. Like I'm like this super
Oh, that's right.
erudite
You lived
person. When
you
I was
lived in
working on
Italy
Night
for a
Fisher,
while.
that's right. Yeah. So it was my junior year in college when I started Night Fisher. I was studying abroad in Italy and thirsty for reading comics. I was kind of rediscovering comics at that time, and deciding to take a stab at Night Fisher, which was supposed to be like 60 pages, turned into 144. And the comics that were around, one of them happened to be the Rubber Blanket translations into Italian, which were, those comic books at that point were impossible to find in the United States, and then to have like fresh printings
Yeah.
of them in Italy was such a blessing. And my Italian was brutal, but I did read them. I learned, I
Yeah.
translated each line and read those comics.
That's
Yeah,
cool. That have been Coconino Press or
yeah,
you?
totally.
Huh.
Yeah, I Gort.
Neat.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
super fortunate, and those editions are stunning.
Huh. Very cool. I've never seen them. So we should probably wrap this up, but I wanted to ask you about this New Yorker cover that you did. I think you said it was your very first one.
Mhm.
You've done a number of really pretty memorable New Yorker covers, certainly through the pandemic as well. But this one really stands out to me because I see it like in a direct lineage with that famous Love and Rockets cover that Jaime did, number 24, I think. So like walk me through that image as an idea, that you're bringing to the magazine.
Yeah. So that was my very first New Yorker cover, as you said, and that came about after years of submitting a few sketches to Francoise at the New Yorker, hoping to get a cover, and that is a tough thing to break into, in no small part because the editor-in-chief, David Remnick,
Mm-hmm.
um, he has the final say, and like it's tough, especially if you've never been published as a cover before. Tough to kind of translate like a rough sketch or a cartoon to a final cover and trust that it's going to turn into something that will represent the entire magazine positively.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that cover came about was they wanted to do a music themed issue, and they actually so Francois called me and they're like, we want to do something young, we want to do something in Brooklyn, we want to do something new, so we're going to try you. And I was like, okay. So instead of me submitting random ideas and trying to get a shoe in, this was my chance to actually try out for like a specific and narrow place that Francois had cut out for me. And they actually sent me to a club that happens to be, it's closed now, but it happened to be 4 blocks from my apartment, and sent me with a music reviewer, and we had a night and we just hung out. And that's based on that club. That middle pillar, it's now an Italian restaurant, but that middle pillar still stands in the Italian restaurant. And
Huh.
I submitted at least 3 or 4 different sketches. I actually don't remember what my different ideas were, but when I finally landed on like this big silhouette of the guitar head, or stock, is that what it's stock? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, the
Um,
neck or the head. Yeah.
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 The like on the cover there, like that locked into place because this is a story I got is that Remnick is a guitar player, so like visualizing himself on stage was like an appealing cover idea. So that was kind of the one that landed on there. And um, I did not I didn't actually think of that Love and Rockets cover, but now that you mention it, it is absolutely in that lineage, and it's the same thing, the guitar from the back, and a crowd
Well,
in a
no, his is more of like a side view.
right.
Yours, I think the coolest thing about yours is that you don't necessarily realize at first that it's, you're kind of seeing it through the guitar player's eyes.
Mm.
Um, you just see the crowd at first, and then, you almost don't even see the the stalk or the head, even though it's right there.
Yeah, right. Right.
It's a
Yeah.
really killer image. And I see it, it's like, I just love how it's just a really fantastic, time capsule of a place at a time and a kind of youth culture. And in the similar way that his was, I
Mm,
guess probably what, 30 years before this.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So were those people just people that you made up after the fact, or were they actually there that night?
I was definitely there with my like sneaking photos of fashion
Uh-huh.
and hairstyles and stuff, like trying to take note of who was
Yeah.
there. And yeah, so but no one specific. There are no specific likenesses. Though a bunch of my friends wrote to me like, "You drew me," and I'm like, "Oh, I did." Like after the fact. Yeah.
That's cool. Well, I'll let you go. I really love talking to you about comics. I can't wait for people to read these books. No one else comes out. I forget the exact date, but it's in November. Um, Night Fisher comes out a month before in October. Is there any last things that I didn't touch on that you wanted to bring up? Not to put you on the spot.
No, I think that's it.
Any
I think
parting
that's it.
thoughts?
Yeah. Any parting thoughts? Thank you so much. It was just such a joy to chat with you, Eric. And yeah, I hope I wish I wish the places were open so we could do this in person.
Yeah,
Yeah,
hopefully
yeah,
sometime
yeah, yeah,
in the next year. Awesome.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
thank you, sir. It's great to see you.
Likewise. Thank you for everything, Eric. Thank you for everything and helping me so much on these books.
Oh man, it's been a pleasure.